The light is fading across the terracotta roofs of Trastevere. Down in the narrow streets, the dust of the day's labor is finally settling. The air smells of river mud, cooling stone, and the faint, heavy scent of melting animal fat. At the door of a converted private house, a man steps out of the evening shadows and crosses the threshold. He carries no sword, no heavy shield, only a thick leather bucket, a heavy iron axe, and the patience required for a long, quiet night. He is a watchman of the 7th cohort, and for the next 12 hours, this stone guardhouse is his entire world. Welcome to Sleep History. Tonight, we are stepping into the dark, narrow streets of ancient Rome, long after the crowds have dispersed and the heavy wooden doors of the city's shops have been barred against the night. You would expect the capital of an empire to be ablaze with light and bustling with armored guards. Instead, the sprawling districts are wrapped in a heavy, pitch-black silence, watched over by quiet men looking for the smallest spark. We will spend this night at a fixed post with a single watchman of the 7th cohort of the vigiles, stationed in the working-class district of Trastevere. There are no grand battles here, no chariot chases, and no political intrigues. The story tonight is simply the slow, deliberate passage of time inside a stone guardhouse. We will look at the heavy leather tools of his trade, the slow burning of a tallow torch, and the quiet discipline of a long watch. Lie back, adjust your pillows, and breathe slowly. We have the whole night ahead of us, and nothing to do but listen to the quiet breathing of the ancient city.
The sun does not vanish all at once over the city of Rome. Long after the bright glare of the afternoon is dipped behind the high pine-covered crest of the Janiculum Hill, a deep bruised purple lingers in the sky above the Tiber River. Down here, in the winding, narrow streets of Trastevere, the light surrenders much earlier than it does on the grand hills of the city center. This is the 14th region of Rome, sitting quiet and densely packed on the right bank of the river. The tall apartment blocks, the insulae, lean close together over the alleys, casting long, heavy shadows that swallow the lower floors completely, while the uppermost terracotta roofs still hold the last faint warmth of the daylight. The heat of the day, baked deep into the paving stones and the thick plaster walls of the buildings, begins to lift. It rises up slowly to meet the cooling evening air, creating a soft, shifting haze just above the street level. Our watchman walks through this shifting air with a slow, measured pace. There is no need to hurry. The night will be long enough, and rushing only expends the energy he will need in the deep, quiet hours before dawn. His thick, hobnailed sandals make a dull, rhythmic scraping sound against the large, polygonal blocks of dark basalt that pave the thoroughfare. It is a quiet, steady sound, entirely unbothered by the lingering remnants of the day's traffic. Each footstep grounds him in the present moment as he makes his way toward his post. You would expect the narrow streets of a working-class district to clear out immediately as the darkness sets in, as sensible citizens lock themselves away from the shadows. Instead, the transition from day to night is remarkably slow, a gradual and reluctant retreat of voices, movement, and labor. A heavy wooden shutter is pulled closed with a soft thud on a second floor above him. A baker, his tunic dusted white, sweeps the last of his flour out the door of his shop, the stiff bristles of his broom scratching in a slow rhythm against the stone threshold. The heavy wooden doors of the corner taverns are being pulled shut for the evening, muffling the low, steady hum of conversation within. Small oil lamps begin to flicker in the narrow windows above, casting faint, trembling pools of orange light against the brickwork of the neighboring buildings. The district is slowly folding itself away, preparing to sleep. As he walks, the watchman breathes in the complex, layered scent of the Roman evening. The air here in Trastevere carries the dark smell of the river moving sluggishly against its banks. It mixes with the faint metallic tang of cooling iron from a shut-down smithy in the next alley over, and the lingering scent of wood smoke from 100 small cooking fires. Underneath it all is the permanent, dry, dusty smell of crushed terracotta, old mortar, and worn stone. It is the smell of a sprawling metropolis that has been building, decaying, and rebuilding itself for centuries.
Yet, the organization of this particular nightly duty is quite new to the ancient city. It is a system born not of deep antiquity, but of recent necessity. It was only a few decades ago, in the year 6 CE, that the Emperor Augustus looked upon a capital chronically vulnerable to the sudden, devastating ravages of fire and decided to bring a permanent order to the night. Rome was a city of wood and oil, a dense forest of timber beams, thatched awnings, and open flames. The old systems of private brigades and temporary watches had failed too many times. Entire neighborhoods had been reduced to white ash in a matter of hours. To counter the constant threat, Augustus divided the sprawling mass of Rome into 14 distinct administrative regions. To guard them, he raised the vigiles, the watchmen. He established 7 cohorts, an enormous undertaking that placed nearly 7,000 men on the payroll of the state. Each cohort, a massive body of roughly 1,000 men, was assigned to watch over 2 of the city's 14 regions. Tonight, as it has been for years, the responsibility for Trastevere, Region 14, and its neighboring district across the water falls to the 7th cohort. For the men of the watch walking these streets, the grand scale of imperial administration dissolves into the simple physical reality of the ground they must cover. They do not think of the empire or the vast borders being held in Germania or Britannia. They think of the next intersection. They think of the dry, untreated timber of a precarious balcony leaning too far over a narrow alley. They think of the slight shift of the evening wind carrying an errant spark from a careless blacksmith's forge. The structure of their command is rigorous, modeled on the military, but adapted for the stone canyons of the city. The watchman knows his place within it. The entire apparatus of the 7 cohorts is commanded from above by a single equestrian prefect, the praefectus vigilum, a man who answers only to the emperor himself. Below the prefect, the 7th cohort is divided into 7 centuries. Each century contains roughly 70 to 80 men, commanded by a centurion who drills them in discipline, movement, and the quiet vigilance required for the night. But out here in the darkening streets, the hierarchy feels distant. The watchman is alone with his thoughts and the cooling air. He wears a simple, heavy tunic, belted at the waist. The evening is mild, but the thick fabric offers a necessary layer against the dampness that will rise from the river after midnight. He carries no heavy armor, no crested helmet, no polished shield. His task is not to conquer, but to observe, to contain, and to endure. He turns a familiar corner, leaving the wider thoroughfare for a much narrower side street. The shadows here are absolute. The tall buildings on either side block out whatever pale light remains in the sky. He knows the uneven dips in the road by heart, stepping easily over a small depression in the paving stones where rainwater sometimes pools, though tonight
The stones are bone dry and coated in a fine, pale dust that clings to his sandals.
He reaches out a hand, trailing his fingertips lightly along the rough, plastered wall of the alleyway as he walks. The wall is still faintly warm. The physical reality of Rome is solid beneath his hands, a dense labyrinth of stone, brick, wattle, and timber that houses roughly 1,000,000 sleeping souls. The sheer scale of the sleeping city is a quiet, heavy presence pressing in on the narrow street. At the end of this winding alley stands the excubatorium of the 7th cohort. It does not look like a military fortress because it was never built to be one. When the vigiles were formed, the state did not clear vast tracts of land to build imposing barracks. Instead, they adapted the city that already existed. This excubatorium is simply a converted private house woven directly into the tight, unyielding fabric of the working-class neighborhood. The state purchased a large, older residence with a central courtyard and repurposed it for the men of the watch. From the outside, it is entirely unassuming. There are no grand stone columns, no imposing battlements, no marble statues flanking the entrance to announce the presence of imperial authority. It is just a long, blank wall of brick and faded plaster, entirely indistinguishable from the structures on either side of it. The only indication that it is anything more than a large domestic dwelling is the heavy, reinforced wooden door that serves as its single point of entry from the street. The watchman approaches the entrance and stops. He takes a long, slow breath, letting the dust and the quiet of the street settle into his lungs. He places his hand flat against the wood of the door. The timber is dark and smooth, worn to a dull polish by the hands of hundreds of men pushing it open night after night, year after year. Thick, heavy iron studs run along its edges and across its center panels, cold to the touch in the evening air. He leans his weight against the wood and pushes the door inward. It moves heavily, resisting for a moment, before groaning softly on its massive iron hinges. The sound is low and familiar, a deep creak that signals the true beginning of his night. Stepping carefully over the raised stone threshold, he leaves the open streets of Rome behind him. The air inside the entrance hall is noticeably different. It is cooler, utterly still, and smells faintly of damp stone, old leather, and the lingering waxy scent of tallow. The high ceilings of the converted house trap the cool air, providing a stark contrast to the lingering heat of the open streets. He turns back to the doorway. Gripping the heavy iron ring on the inside of the door, he pulls it shut. The heavy wood swings into its frame with a solid, echoing thud that reverberates briefly off the stone walls of the entranceway. He lifts the thick iron latch and drops it into place with a dull clank. The sound of the city outside, the distant murmur of the river, the barking of a stray dog, the settling of the timbers in the neighboring buildings is instantly muffled, cut off by the thick walls of the house. For the rest of the night, he will not leave this structure. He will not patrol the alleys or walk the riverbanks. He is the watchman assigned to the post itself, the man who guards the guardhouse. His watch has begun, and his world has officially narrowed to the quiet stone boundaries of the walls around him. The heavy wooden street door has been barred, and the deep, resonant thud of its closure still seems to hum faintly in the thick walls of the entryway. The watchman stands for a moment in the vestibule, letting his eyes adjust completely to the dimness. This narrow corridor, serving as the bridge between the public street and the private interior, is draped in thick shadows. He breathes in slowly.
The air here is trapped and cool, holding the distinct earthy scent of old settled dust, old stone, and the faint, lingering aroma of olive oil from a lamp burning somewhere further inside. He steps forward, his hobnailed sandals clicking with a muted, rhythmic precision against the laid brick of the floor. With a slow, deliberate pace, he leaves the narrow corridor and emerges into the heart of the excubatorium, the central courtyard. When the state purchased this property to serve as the headquarters of the 7th cohort in Trastevere, they did not level the structure to build a standard military barracks. They simply took the traditional Roman domus, a wealthy family's private house, and adapted it to their needs. The courtyard is the grand atrium of that former home. It is a wide, open space, anchored by the architecture of the past, but worn down by the daily utilitarian reality of the present. Above him, the roof opens up to the night. A large rectangular aperture, known as the compluvium, has been cut into the ceiling, sloping downward to direct rainwater into the house. Through this opening, the watchman can see a framed square of the sky. The deep, bruised purple of the early evening has finally given way to a heavy, fathomless black. A few pale stars have begun to prick through the darkness, cold and distant, completely indifferent to the sleeping city. Directly beneath the opening in the roof lies the impluvium, a shallow, sunken pool built into the floor to catch the falling rain. The water inside it is perfectly still tonight, acting as a dark mirror that reflects the faint starlight from above. The watchman pauses by the edge of the basin. The stone rim is smooth, worn down by decades of men sitting on its edge to lace their sandals or sharpen their tools. The quiet in this central space is profound. The thick walls of the surrounding rooms insulate the courtyard from the street, creating a pocket of absolute stillness. The only sound is the incredibly soft, almost imperceptible shifting of his own tunic as he breathes. He turns his attention away from the dark water and looks toward the far wall of the courtyard. There, illuminated by the warm, trembling glow of a single small oil lamp, is the lararium, the shrine. Every Roman house has a shrine to the household gods, a sacred space meant to protect the family and the property. When the vigiles took over this house, they did not destroy the domestic shrine, they simply adopted it, transforming it to serve their own unique brotherhood. It is a structure of quiet, modest beauty, built directly into the brickwork of the wall. It takes the shape of an edicula, a miniature temple, complete with 2 small stucco columns supporting a small triangular pediment.
The watchman walks slowly across the courtyard toward the warm light. As he draws closer, the details of the shrine resolve themselves in the flickering glow of the terracotta lamp. The light is soft and golden, casting long, wavering shadows across the painted plaster. The lamp itself is small, no larger than his palm, shaped like a shallow teardrop with a blackened spout where a linen wick draws up the olive oil. It is a quiet, steady flame, carefully tended by whichever man holds the watch. You would expect a cohort of fire watchmen, men who face burning buildings and unruly streets in the dead of night, to direct their primary worship toward Mars, the god of war, or perhaps Vulcan, the god of the forge and the flame. Instead, the deepest reverence in this building is paid to something much closer to home, something far more intimate, the genius of the century. In the center of the shrine's painted back wall, illuminated by the trembling light, stands the figure of the genius. This is not a distant Olympian deity. The genius is the divine spark, the guiding spirit of this specific group of men and the building they occupy. The figure is painted wearing a white toga, the fabric drawn respectfully over its head in the traditional manner of a priest preparing to make a sacrifice. In one hand, the painted figure holds a cornucopia, a symbol of abundance and well-being. In the other, a small, shallow bowl, the patera, used for offering wine. Flanking the central spirit are the lares, the ancient guardians of the crossroads and the household. They are painted as youthful dancing figures in short tunics, holding drinking horns raised high. The colors of the fresco, deep Pompeian reds, earthy ochres, and pale seafoam greens, have begun to fade and flake near the edges, worn by the dampness of the Roman winters and the smoke of countless lamps over the decades. Yet in the dim light of the courtyard, the figures seem to step forward from the plaster, animated by the shifting shadows. At the very bottom of the painted scene, resting below the feet of the figures, two large crested serpents are depicted slithering through green shrubs toward a central altar. These are the agatodiamona, the protective spirits of the physical earth upon which the guardhouse is built. Their painted scales are detailed with tiny, meticulous brushstrokes, a testament to the care taken by whatever nameless artisan originally decorated the wall. The watchman stops directly in front of the shrine. He does not fall to his knees, nor does he cry out in fervent prayer. The religion of the watch is one of quiet duty and structured ritual, not ecstatic emotion. He reaches into a small pouch hanging from his belt and withdraws a tiny pinch of coarse spelt wheat. Beside the oil lamp on the flat ledge of the shrine rests a small, shallow bronze dish, darkened by years of use. With a slow, respectful motion, the watchman drops the grains of spelt into the dish. The dry grains make a soft, scratching sound against the metal, a tiny, private noise that vanishes instantly into the quiet of the courtyard.
He bows his head slightly. He does not speak aloud. The invocation is entirely silent, a familiar pattern of thoughts directed towards the spirit of the watchhouse. He asks for the continued safety of the men currently sleeping in the barracks rooms behind him. He asks for clarity of sight in the dark. He asks that the walls remain sturdy, that the roof holds against the weather, and that the long hours of the night pass without incident. It is a practical, grounded petition, deeply rooted in the physical reality of his work. Standing before the lararium, he feels the weight of the years pressing softly against the stones of the excubatorium. This house was standing long before the Emperor Augustus formed the vigiles, and it will likely stand long after this particular watchman has finished his 6 years of service. Decades from now, perhaps centuries, long after the roof has fallen in and the walls have been buried by the slow accumulation of time and earth, the foundation of this shrine will remain. The paint may fade to dust, but the structure of this quiet reverence is woven into the very masonry of the neighborhood. He lifts his head. The small wick of the oil lamp sputters for a fraction of a second, settling back into a smooth, tear-shaped flame. It smells of warm oil and the faint, charred scent of old linen. The smell is comforting, a familiar domestic anchor in a city that can often feel vast and unknowable. He takes a half step back from the shrine, his duty to the genius fulfilled for the evening. The courtyard behind him remains entirely still. The square of night sky above the compluvium has deepened into an absolute, star-flecked black. The water in the impluvium remains perfectly undisturbed. The transition from the chaotic energy of the daylight to the solemn, structured quiet of the night watch is complete. The physical boundaries of the guardhouse have enclosed him, and the spiritual center of the house has been acknowledged. There is nothing left to do now but prepare for the physical labor of the long hours ahead. He turns away from the warm golden light of the lararium and looks towards the darker corridors that lead deeper into the excubatorium. The heavy tools of his trade are waiting. The night has officially taken hold. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the dark, empty streets of Trastevere. But inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The watchman turns his back on the open courtyard and the delicate, flickering light of the lararium. He moves deliberately toward the deeper interior of the excubatorium, stepping beneath a low stone archway that leads away from the remnants of the grand domestic house and into the purely functional spaces of the watch. The air changes almost immediately as he crosses this threshold. Behind him, the courtyard held the cool, clean draft of the open night sky. Ahead of him, the atmosphere is noticeably thicker, trapped beneath heavy timber ceilings and carrying a dense, utilitarian scent that permeates every inch of the stonework. This is the staging room, a wide, low-ceilinged space positioned just off the main vestibule. It is here that the men of the century prepare themselves for the long hours of the dark. The room is steeped in shadows, illuminated only by the faint residual glow of a small charcoal hearth built into the far corner. The watchman walks toward this hearth, his boots scuffing softly against the bare, packed earth of the floor. There is no decorative brickwork here, no painted plaster on the walls. The luxury of the old house was stripped away in these back rooms to make way for the heavy, unglamorous equipment required to keep the city safe. He approaches a long, heavy wooden table pushed against the side wall. The surface of the timber is scarred, blackened in places by old burns, and coated in a permanent, slick sheen. This table is the center of a daily, necessary ritual. The watchman reaches out and rests his hand on a large, pale block resting at the end of the table. It is cold to the touch, dense, and slightly greasy. This is sebum, hard, rendered animal fat. In a wealthy Roman household, the night is held at bay by the clean, bright burn of pressed olive oil in terracotta lamps, or by the slow, sweet-smelling consumption of expensive beeswax candles. Those materials are refined, clear, and perfectly suited to the dining rooms of the elite. But the vigiles do not deal in luxury, and the vast scale of their nightly work requires a fuel that is abundant, cheap, and fiercely practical. They rely on the butcher's scrap, the thick deposits of fat harvested from sheep and cattle, boiled down and cooled into solid yellowish-white blocks. You would expect the protectors of the eternal city to be associated with the gleam of polished bronze, the sharp edge of a master-crafted sword, or the striking profile of a crested helmet. Instead, their very identity is tied to the humble, heavy scent of rendered animal fat. The citizens of Rome know this smell well. When they see the watchmen walking the streets after dark, they do not call them soldiers or guards. They call them the Sebasari, the tallow men.
It is a nickname born of the streets, an acknowledgement of the pungent agricultural odor that clings to the men of the cohorts. The smell of the sebum never truly washes away. It settles into the coarse weave of their woolen tunics. It coats the calluses on their hands. Even on their days off, visiting the public baths or walking through the markets, a watchman can often be recognized simply by the faint, lingering scent of cold tallow that marks him as a creature of the night watch. It is not a glamorous title, but it is an honest one, and the men bear it with a quiet, stubborn pride. The watchman begins the slow process of preparing his light for the evening. He is stationed at the fixed post tonight, confined to the interior of the guardhouse, but he still requires a steady, reliable flame to illuminate the vestibule and the equipment racks near the main door. The small oil lamp at the shrine is for the gods, the tallow torch is for the working man. He pulls a small iron-bladed knife from his belt. The metal makes a soft scraping sound against the leather sheath. He grips the heavy block of tallow with his left hand and begins to carve away thick curled shavings of the fat. The blade moves smoothly through the dense material. As he cuts, the raw, heavy scent of the sebum rises into the air, smelling distinctly of the pastures and the stockyards, a stark contrast to the urban stone that surrounds him. He lets the pale yellow shavings fall into a battered copper melting pot that sits on the table. The pot is old, its sides dented and blackened by years of exposure to direct heat, but the metal is thick and holds the temperature perfectly. When he has carved away a sufficient pile of the fat, he returns his knife to its sheath and picks up the pot by its long iron handle. He carries the copper vessel over to the small hearth in the corner of the room. A bed of coals still glows beneath a layer of white ash left over from the evening meal cooked hours earlier. Taking a long iron poker from a hook on the wall, he gently stirs the ashes. The quiet scraping of the iron against the brick hearth breaks the silence of the room. Beneath the ash, the oak coals awaken, glowing a sudden angry red in the dimness. The heat radiates outward, warming the front of his tunic and casting a soft reddish light across his face. He sets the copper pot directly onto a heavy iron trivet positioned over the coals. Now he must wait. The transformation of the tallow is a slow, methodical process, and it cannot be rushed. The watchman stands quietly by the hearth, watching the pale yellow shavings inside the pot. In the absolute quiet of the locked guardhouse, he can hear exactly the moment the heat begins to take hold. A faint, low sizzle starts at the bottom of the vessel. Slowly, the edges of the carved fat begin to soften and lose their shape. The solid, opaque white melts down into a thick, translucent liquid that pools at the base of the copper pot. As the liquid heats, the smell in the room deepens, becoming richer and more intense. It is a heavy, smothering aroma, thick with the scent of roasted meat and burning marrow. It fills the low-ceilinged room, pushing out the smell of the damp stone and settling heavily over the space. While the tallow finishes melting, the watchman turns to prepare the physical structure of his torch. He walks over to a large wooden barrel standing upright in the corner. Inside are dozens of wooden shafts, harvested from thick branches of ash or hazel, stripped of their bark and cut to roughly the length of a man's arm. He reaches in and selects one. The wood is dry, lightweight, and completely unadorned. Next, he moves to a wooden crate resting on the floor nearby. This crate holds the wrapping material. Piles of coarse linen strips torn from discarded tunics, old grain sacks, and lengths of raw hemp tow. A torch is not simply a piece of wood set on fire. It is a carefully constructed vessel designed to hold and burn the fuel. He takes a long, thick strip of rough linen, the edges frayed and uneven. Returning to the table, he begins to bind the top of the wooden shaft. He works with practiced, unhurried movements.
He anchors the end of the linen against the wood with his thumb, then pulls the fabric tightly around the shaft, layering it over itself again and again to create a thick, bulbous head at the top of the stick. He pulls the fabric taut, ensuring there is no slack, wrapping it into a dense, secure knot. He takes a length of thin, coarse twine and ties it tightly around the base of the linen bulb, securing it firmly to the wood. The binding must be tight. If the fabric is loose, the burning tallow will drip too quickly, or the entire flaming mass might slide off the handle in the middle of the night. He walks back to the hearth. Inside the copper pot, the sebum has completely liquefied. It is now a clear, golden oil, bubbling very softly at the edges where the copper meets the heat. The watchman wraps a thick rag around the hot iron handle of the pot and lifts it carefully from the trivet. He carries it back to the work table, setting it down with a heavy, metallic clank. Now begins the dipping. He takes the prepared wooden shaft by its base and slowly plunges the linen-wrapped head into the liquid fat. The hot oil hisses loudly as it meets the dry fabric. Small bubbles rise to the surface as the linen absorbs the dense liquid fuel, pulling it deep into the tightly bound layers. He leaves it submerged for a long moment, ensuring the core of the wrapping is entirely saturated. When he lifts the torch from the pot, the heavy liquid fat streams off the linen head, falling back into the copper vessel with a rhythmic splashing sound. The linen is now darkened to a deep, translucent yellow. He holds the torch steady in the air, slowly rotating the shaft in his hands.
The air in the cold stone room goes to work immediately. As the hot oil meets the cooler temperature of the staging area, it begins to solidify. The glossy, liquid sheen on the surface of the linen turns cloudy, then opaque. Within a few moments, the liquid fat has hardened into a thick, white, waxy crust, sealing the saturated fabric beneath a protective layer of solid sebum. He dips the torch a second time. The hot oil melts the outer crust for a fraction of a second before layering more fat onto the head. He lifts it, lets it drain, and holds it up to cool again. The head of the torch is now heavy, a thick, bulbous mass of solid animal fat, waiting only for a spark to release its energy. The watchman sets the finished torch down on the edge of the table. He covers the copper pot with a wooden lid to keep the remaining fat free of dust, and uses his tongs to bury the hot coals in the hearth back under their blanket of white ash, preserving their heat for the next man who might need them. The quiet routine of the work has settled his mind, anchoring him firmly in the physical reality of his post. He picks up the heavy, tallow-coated torch. Walking back out into the main vestibule of the excubatorium, he moves toward a small iron sconce bolted to the masonry wall near the main street door. A small secondary oil lamp has been left burning on a ledge nearby for precisely this purpose. He holds the waxy head of the torch directly over the small flame of the oil lamp. For a moment, nothing happens. The solid fat resists the heat. Then, slowly, the white crust begins to weep, dropping a single bead of liquid tallow on the stone floor. A wisp of dark smoke curls upward from the linen. Suddenly, the fat catches. The flame does not bloom gently. It roars to life with a low, wet hiss, expanding instantly into a large, thick, jagged blade of orange fire. The light it casts is entirely different from the polite, trembling glow of the shrine in the courtyard. The tallow flame is aggressive and bright, illuminating the deep corners of the vestibule with a stark, restless energy. It is a dirty burn. Thick ribbons of heavy black soot spiral upward from the flame, rising toward the timber ceiling to join the dark stains left by decades of previous watches. The sputtering of the burning fat sounds like meat roasting on an open spit, a constant, rhythmic popping and crackling that fills the silence of the entrance hall. The watchman slides the base of the wooden shaft into the iron sconce on the wall. The heavy torch sits securely in its bracket, casting long, wavering shadows across the floor and illuminating the heavy, reinforced planks of the main door. The thick scent of the burning sebum rolls off the flame, filling the narrow corridor with the undeniable signature of the Sebasiri. He steps back, crossing his arms loosely over his heavy tunic. He looks at the flame, watching the way the orange light plays across the rough texture of the plastered wall. The guardhouse is no longer entirely dark. He has built his light from the raw materials of the city, and it will burn steadily for hours, an unyielding sentinel against the shadows pressing in from the street outside. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the heavy scent of the tallow smoke, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark. The heavy tallow torch is now seated securely in its iron sconce, and its large, ragged flame dictates the atmosphere of the vestibule. The light it casts is not steady. It wavers and snaps, sending long, stretching shadows across the floor and up the sides of the corridor. As the orange glow pushes back the darkness, it illuminates the long expanse of the plastered wall running alongside the guardhouse entrance. In the bright, unforgiving light of the Roman afternoon, this wall looks worn and neglected. But here, in the isolated, flickering light of the night watch, the wall transforms. The shadows catch in thousands of tiny, deliberate grooves scratched into the plaster, throwing them into sharp relief. The entire surface of the wall, from the height of a man's knee up to as high as he can reach, is covered in script. You would expect a military outpost, strictly drilled and managed by the highest authorities of the empire, to maintain pristine, whitewashed walls, enforcing a rigid visual discipline upon its men. Instead, the plaster of the excubatorium is a chaotic, overlapping record of human existence, entirely covered in the rough, sprawling handwriting of the watchmen themselves. The watchman steps away from the heavy timber door and moves closer to the plaster. He has seen this wall 1,000 times. He has walked past it every night of his service. Yet, in the quiet, isolated hours of a fixed post, it commands a different kind of attention. It is a quiet company in an otherwise empty corridor. The lower half of the wall was once painted a deep, traditional Roman red, while the upper half was left a plain, creamy white. Now, the colors are muted by years of oily soot and the dust of the street. But the surface is fiercely alive. Generations of men from the 7th cohort have stood exactly where this watchman stands now, waiting for the dawn, guarding the door, or killing time before their rotation out into the dark streets. And while they waited, they left their mark. He reaches out, raising his hand to the rough surface. His broad, calloused fingertips brush lightly over the plaster. It feels dry and chalky, shedding a microscopic layer of pale dust against his skin. The wall is deeply scarred. Men have used whatever sharp implements they had on hand to cut into the masonry. Some used the pointed iron tips of their utility knives. Others used heavy iron nails pried from a discarded plank, or a sharpened stylus of bone meant for wax tablets. The carvings cut through the smooth outer layer of the painted plaster, exposing the coarse, pale grit of the mortar underneath. When the torchlight hits these shallow trenches, the white mortar glows faintly against the soot-stained red paint, making the letters leap out from the stone.
He traces the outline of a large, slanted letter S with his thumb. The script on this wall bears no resemblance to the grand, monumental capitals carved into the marble temples of the Forum or the triumphant arches of the emperors. Those grand inscriptions are perfectly spaced, deeply channeled by master stonemasons to project eternal authority. The writing here is the cursive script of the working class. It is hasty, leaning heavily to the right, filled with abbreviated words and connected letters. It is the raw, unpolished handwriting of freedmen and former slaves who learned their letters not in elite academies, but on the docks, in the markets, or from the older men in the cohort. The watchman reads the lines illuminated near his shoulder. The messages are simple, repetitive, and deeply grounded in the physical reality of their duties. Many are straightforward records of a job completed. He recognizes the familiar phrase, scratched over and over in different hands, at different angles. Sebasharia fecit. He made the tallow watch. It is a humble boast. It is a man standing in this quiet hall, smelling the heavy animal fat burning on his torch, and deciding to leave a permanent record that he was here, that he held the light against the dark, and that he survived the long hours of the shift. Below one such phrase, the carver has carefully etched the date, naming the consuls of that year to mark the exact time of his service. Another cluster of scratches, slightly higher up, lists the names of an entire squad, men of a specific century who served together. The names are distinctly Roman, Marcus, Gaius, Lucius, but they belong to men who walked the lowest rungs of the social ladder. They are men who spent their nights carrying heavy leather buckets and iron hooks, fighting the smoke and the flames of the crowded slums. By scratching their names into the wall of the excubatorium, they staked a small claim on the city they protected. The watchman moves slowly down the length of the wall, letting the light of the tallow torch guide his eyes. The graffiti overlaps itself in places, new names carved aggressively over older, faded ones, creating a dense thicket of letters. In some spots, a bored watchman has taken the time to carve a crude caricature of a harsh centurion or a rough sketch of a local tavern keeper. In another corner, a series of simple vertical hash marks tracks the slow, agonizing countdown of days remaining in a man's 6-year term of service. There is a profound, quiet intimacy to this vandalism. The emperor has his name carved on the sides of aqueducts and the pediments of great basilicas, visible to the entire world. The men of the 7th cohort have only this single hidden hallway in a repurposed house in Trastevere. But to them, this wall is a monument. It is the only place in the vast, indifferent machinery of the Roman Empire where their daily labor is permanently recorded and acknowledged.
The watchman finds a blank patch of red plaster, just a few inches wide, located near the wooden frame of an interior doorway. He does not pull his knife to add to the wall tonight. He has already carved his own name, months ago, on a different wall near the barracks. But he rests his hand flat over the empty space, feeling the cool, solid presence of the brick beneath the plaster. Centuries from this night, the heavy wooden doors of this guardhouse will finally rot away. The roof will collapse, bringing the heavy terracotta tiles crashing down into the courtyard. The city of Rome will shift and change, rising in some places and falling in others. The dirt and debris of 1,000 years will slowly fill this vestibule, burying the lower walls under feet of compacted earth. The very existence of the 7th cohort will fade into the obscure shadows of distant history. But tonight, the wall belongs only to the watchman and the flickering torch. He steps back from the plaster, letting his hand drop to his side.
The deep quiet of the excubatorium settles around him once more, briefly interrupted by the wet, rhythmic hiss of a pocket of air popping inside the burning tallow head above him. The physical act of reading the wall has grounded him. It reminds him that he is not entirely alone in the dark. He is surrounded by the ghosts of his cohort, by the thousands of men who have stood this exact post, who have smelled the exact same wood smoke and damp river air, who have fought the heavy pull of sleep in the hours before dawn. The building is saturated with their memory. Every worn stone on the threshold, every polished iron ring, and every scratched letter on the plaster is a testament to the endless, unbroken chain of the watch. He turns his gaze away from the wall and looks deeper into the staging area. It is time to inspect the heavy equipment, to ensure the tools of their trade are ready should the alarm ever sound. He pulls his heavy woolen cloak a little tighter over his shoulders against the mild chill of the vestibule. The night is still young, and the rhythm of his solitary duty has only just begun to take hold. He leaves the wall of names behind him, bathed in the dancing, aggressive light of the tallow flame, a silent chorus standing guard in the stone corridor. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the heavy soot of the tallow smoke, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The watchman steps away from the plastered wall and the overlapping scratched names of his predecessors. He moves deeper into the staging area of the vestibule, leaving the most agitated, flickering light of the tallow torch behind him. As he steps out of the direct glare, the shadows soften, pooling thickly in the corners of the room. The air in this section of the excubatorium holds a different character. The heavy, greasy odor of the burning sebum is still present, but here it is met and overpowered by a sharp, profoundly utilitarian mixture of scents. It smells of cured leather, hardened pine pitch, cold iron, and the deep, acidic tang of stale vinegar. This is the armory of the 7th cohort, but the weapons stored here are not designed for the battlefield. There are no racks of polished gladii, no tall, curved shields waiting for a legionary formation, and no quivers of iron-tipped arrows. The enemies the men of the watch face do not march in ranks or carry banners. They are silent, formless, and entirely indifferent to the empire. They are the errant spark, the overturned oil lamp, and the dry, decaying timber of the city's endless apartment blocks. To fight this enemy, the state provides a very specific arsenal. The watchman walks over to a long, low wooden rack built against the stone wall. Lined up in perfect, unyielding rows are dozens of heavy buckets. He reaches down and rests his hand on the rim of the nearest one. The bucket is not made of wood, and it is not made of metal. It is a hama, formed entirely of thick, boiled cowhide. A wooden bucket, if dropped from a height by a clumsy hand or an exhausted man, will splinter and shatter, becoming instantly useless. A metal bucket is too heavy to pass quickly and will warp or scald the hands when exposed to intense heat. Leather is the perfect compromise. It is incredibly durable, lightweight when empty, and flexible enough to survive the chaotic, punishing environment of a nighttime emergency. He runs his thumb along the top edge of the hama. The leather is stiff and unyielding, hardened by the boiling process and heavily scarred by years of rough use. Down the side of the bucket, thick, waxy hemp thread holds the heavy seams together, stitched with large, deliberate loops by a military cobbler. But leather alone will not hold water for long. To make the buckets watertight, the interiors are thickly coated with dark, sticky pine tar. The watchman leans in slightly,
and the sharp, resinous smell of the pitch fills his nose. It is a clean forest scent, entirely out of place in the dusty stone canyons of Trastevere. The pitch seals the seams and coats the hide, ensuring that every drop drawn from the city's public fountains makes it to the flames. The physical reality of fighting a fire in Rome is an exercise in exhausting rhythmic endurance. The vigiles do not have the luxury of pressurized hoses or deep cisterns at the site of any incident. They rely entirely on the bucket line. When a blaze breaks out, the man of the century must instantly form a human chain, stretching from the burning structure all the way down the street to the nearest lacus, one of the hundreds of public water basins fed by the aqueducts.
The watchman knows the brutal, repetitive discipline of the line. Full, heavy buckets of water are passed up the chain, hand to hand, muscle to muscle, in a silent, desperate rhythm. Empty buckets are tossed back down a second line to be refilled. It requires perfect coordination, a shared, unbroken tempo that can last for hours until the men's shoulders burn and their hands are rubbed raw by the heavy hemp rope handles. Tonight, however, the buckets sit perfectly still in the dark, dry and waiting, lined up like silent, patient soldiers in the shadows. He moves away from the rows of hami and walks toward a large, heavy wooden chest resting directly on the stone floor. The lid is thick oak, bound with strips of iron. He lifts the iron latch, allowing it to fall back against the wood with a dull, heavy clank, and pushes the heavy lid open. Immediately, the sharp, sour smell of vinegar rises from the chest, pungent enough to make the eyes water if a man were to lean too closely. Inside the chest, folded into massive, heavy squares, are the centones. These are large, incredibly dense mats woven from rough patchwork cloth, discarded ship's sails, old tunics, and scrap canvas, all layered and stitched together to form blankets as thick as a man's thumb. But they are not meant for sleeping. The centones are smothering mats. You would expect a fire brigade to rely primarily on endless streams of water to douse the flames. Instead, the reality of a Roman fire often requires a more suffocating approach. Water is heavy to transport and evaporates quickly when it meets the intense, roaring heat of a localized blaze. Vinegar, however, possesses properties that the ancient firefighters swear by. It resists combustion far better than plain water, and it does not steam away as rapidly. The watchman reaches into the chest and touches the top mat. It is damp, cold, and incredibly heavy. The mats are kept permanently soaked in posca, a cheap, sour mixture of water and spoiled wine or vinegar. When a small fire breaks out, a brazier overturned on a wooden floor, or a draped awning catching a spark from a bakery oven, water might just spread the burning oil. Instead, two strong men will carry a heavy, dripping cento and throw it directly over the flames. The dense, wet, sour, vinegar-soaked fabric instantly starves the fire of air, smothering it in a thick, sour cloud of white smoke. He does not attempt to lift the mat tonight. When fully saturated, a large cento requires the strength of 2 or even 3 men to haul up the narrow, winding stairs of a Roman apartment block. He simply verifies that the fabric remains damp to the touch, satisfied that the sour, acidic barrier is ready to do its work if called upon. He closes the heavy lid of the chest, sealing the sharp smell of the vinegar back into the dark wood. The final pieces of equipment on the wall are the most severe. Resting on iron pegs driven deep into the plaster are the tools of demolition.
When a fire in the dense, towering insulae of Rome grows beyond the capacity of the buckets and the smothering mats, the strategy of the vigiles shifts instantly from preservation to destruction. Fire requires fuel, and in the cramped quarters of the city, the only way to save a neighborhood is often to aggressively remove the fuel from the fire's path. Hanging horizontally across the wall are the falses. These are long, thick poles of seasoned ash wood, some reaching 10 feet in length. Fixed to the top of each pole is a massive, curved iron hook, sharpened to a dull, brutal point. The watchman runs his hand along the smooth, polished wood of one of the poles. He knows exactly how heavy it is, how it throws a man's balance off when hoisted into the air. The hooks are designed to grab hold of the heavy terracotta tiles of a burning roof, pulling them down to expose the timber beams beneath. When the roof is gone, the men use the falses to hook into the wooden rafters themselves, hauling backward with all their combined weight, using the long poles as levers to pull down walls, balconies, and entire wooden structures. It is violent, exhausting work, bringing burning debris crashing down into the streets below in a shower of sparks and choking dust, all to create a gap, a fire break that the creeping flames cannot cross. Beneath the long poles hang the secures, the heavy, broad-bladed axes. The watchman lifts one of the axes from its pegs. The handle is shorter than a woodsman's axe, designed to be swung in the tight, confined spaces of an interior hallway or a narrow stairwell. The iron head is thick, heavy, and cold against his palm. The blade is not honed to a razor's edge. It does not need to slice cleanly. It needs to chop, to crush, and to split heavy oak doors and thick structural beams. He holds the axe in the dim light. The weight of the iron is comforting in its solidity. In the chaos of a midnight blaze, when the smoke reduces visibility to a few inches and the roar of the fire drowns out the shouted orders of the centurion, the heavy thud of the axes biting into timber is the only reliable sound a watchman can steer by. It is the sound of the line being drawn, the physical effort of men tearing their own city apart to save it. But tonight, the iron is cold. The heavy ash poles are resting safely on their pegs. The leather buckets are dry, and the vinegar mats are sleeping securely in their chest. There is no smoke in the air, only the familiar domestic smell of the tallow torch burning in the vestibule. The watchman hooks the heavy axe back on its iron pegs. He adjusts it slightly, making sure it sits perfectly balanced. The discipline of the equipment is just as important as the discipline of the men. When the clutting clapper of the alarm bell sounds in the courtyard, there is no time to untangle ropes or search for a misplaced hook. The men must move blindly in the dock, grabbing their assigned beer and rushing out into the street in a matter of seconds. Every item must be exactly where the hand expects it to be.
He steps back, looking over the long wall of tools. The shadows from the vestibule cast long, still lines across the handles and the bucket rims. The excubatorium is a machine, and these tools are its heavy, unglamorous gears. They do not gleam with gold, and they will never be celebrated in a poet's epic verse, but they are the thin, stubborn line between the sleeping citizens of Trastevere and complete ruin. The watchman takes a slow, deep breath, pulling the scent of leather, pine tar, and cold iron deep into his lungs. The inspection is complete. The bucket line is dormant. The tools are ready. He turns away from the armory, the quiet satisfaction of readiness settling over him, and walks slowly back toward the center of the guardhouse, ready to listen to the deep silence of the night.
Having finished his quiet inspection of the armory, the watchman returns to the main vestibule of the excubatorium. He does not pace the length of the corridor, nor does he stand rigidly at attention by the heavy wooden door.
The night is far too long for unnecessary exertion, and the duty of the fixed post requires a different kind of endurance. Against the side wall, situated between the flickering light of the tallow torch and the deep shadows of the interior corridor, rests a heavy oak bench. It is a simple piece of furniture, a scomnum, built of thick, unadorned timber, its surface smoothed by the heavy wool tunics of thousands of men who have sat exactly where he sits now. He lowers himself onto the bench. He rests his forearms on his knees, leaning forward slightly, and allows his body to settle into the hard wood. He lets out a long, slow breath, feeling the tension bleed out of his shoulders. His eyes remain open, but his reliance on them begins to fade. In the deep hours of the night, when the twisting alleys of Trastevere are swallowed by an impenetrable blackness, sight is a strictly limited sense. To guard the city in the dark, a watchman must learn to rely almost entirely on his ears. The true discipline of the fixed post is the discipline of absolute stillness, turning the human body into a finely tuned instrument of hearing. To achieve this, the watchman must first tune out the sounds of his own guardhouse. He must let the ambient noises of the exquisitorium fade into the background of his awareness. The heavy, wet sputtering of the tallow torch above him is a constant rhythmic popping that he learns to ignore. The soft, settling groans of the roof timbers contracting in the cooling night air are dismissed as natural. But there is one sound inside the building that demands an unconscious respect. It comes from a small, darkened alcove just off the vestibule. It is a slow, rhythmic dripping, a hollow, metallic plink that repeats with unyielding consistency. This is the clepsydra, the water clock. The Romans do not measure the night in continuous hours. They divide it into 4 strict vigiles, or watches. To track this slow passage of time in the dark, the guardhouse relies on a simple, ancient mechanism. In the alcove sits a large bronze basin filled with water with a tiny, precisely calibrated hole in its base. Beneath it rests a second, smaller bronze vessel marked with lines on its interior. Drop by solitary drop, the water falls from the upper basin into the lower. The hollow sound of the water striking the bronze is the heartbeat of the watch. It is a hypnotic, deeply soothing sound, a physical manifestation of time passing. The watchman listens to the drip, letting its steady rhythm anchor his focus, pulling him away from the distractions of his own fatigue. With the sounds of the interior categorized and set aside, he extends his awareness outward, pushing his hearing past the thick wooden planks of the main door and into the streets of the 14th region.
You would expect the night in a capital city of nearly 1 million people to be defined by a chaotic, unbroken wall of noise, a constant roar of humanity pressing against the walls of the guardhouse. Instead, the nocturnal landscape is defined by the terrifying clarity of isolated sounds. When the overwhelming blanket of daytime clamor is finally pulled away, the individual noises of the city are laid bare, traveling vast distances through the heavy, cooling air. He hears the river. The excubitorium sits several streets back from the banks of the Tiber, but in the dead of night, the sluggish, heavy current makes itself known. It is not a rushing, violent sound. It is a low, wet, continuous murmur, the sound of dark water swirling around the stone piers of the Pons Aemilius, washing over the mud banks and slapping gently against the wooden hulls of the river barges tied up for the night. The sound of the river is a comforting baseline, a reminder of the permanent geography of the city. Suddenly, a new sound rises above the murmur of the water. It is a low, rhythmic vibration, a deep, grinding rumble that seems to travel upward through the very soles of his sandals. It is distant, perhaps half a mile away, echoing across the basalt paving stones of a wider thoroughfare. It is the sound of heavy wooden wheels banded in iron. By the decree of the Lex Julia Municipalis, a law passed by Julius Caesar decades ago, heavy transport carts and supply wagons are strictly forbidden from entering the chaotic, congested streets of Rome during the daylight hours. The daytime belongs to the pedestrians, the litters, and the merchants. But when the sun goes down, the massive logistics of the empire are unleashed. The night is when the massive blocks of marble are hauled from the river docks to the building sites of the emperors. It is when the endless amphorae of grain, olive oil, and wine are transported to the warehouses. The watchman listens to the slow, agonizing grind of the distant cart. He can hear the heavy, rhythmic striking of the oxen's hooves against the stone, the sharp, echoing crack of the driver's whip, and the groaning protests of the wagon's axles. Because the streets of Trastevere are a dense, twisting maze of narrow alleys, the massive carts cannot penetrate deep into this specific neighborhood. The watchman is sitting in a pocket of profound silence, surrounded on the periphery by the heavy industrial rumbling of the city feeding itself. The sound eventually fades, swallowed by the winding architecture, leaving the silence of the alley feeling even deeper than before. He shifts his weight slightly on the wooden bench. The air is growing colder, carrying the damp chill of the river valley. The watchman's ears are constantly filtering, sorting the benign sounds from the dangerous. A sharp, sudden clatter rings out from a rooftop 2 streets over, followed by a frantic scratching of claws against terracotta tiles. The watchman does not tense. It is only the feral cats of the district, hunting the rats that live in the heavy thatched awnings of the bakeries.
A low, mournful howl rises from the direction of the Janiculum Hill, answered quickly by a chorus of sharp, aggressive barks closer to the river. The pariah dogs, the stray mongrels that roam the edges of the city, are a nuisance, but they are not a threat to the watch. He lets the sound wash over him, filing it away as normal. What he is listening for is far more subtle. Fire, before it becomes a roaring, visible beast, has a very specific auditory signature. It does not announce itself with a thunderclap. It begins as a whisper. The watchman has been trained to listen for a sound that closely mimics a mouse scratching inside a plaster wall. It is a faint, dry, papery crinkle. It is the sound of a forgotten ember slowly eating its way through the dry rushes of a floor mat, or the quiet, steady sizzle of spilled lamp oil spreading across a wooden table. If left unchecked, that papery crinkle evolves into a sharp, distinct popping noise, the sound of moisture inside the timber boiling and snapping the wood fibers apart. If he hears that pop, followed by the low, hollow rush of air being drawn into a newly formed draft, the stillness of the night will shatter. The heavy iron bell in the courtyard will be rung, the leather buckets will be snatched from the wall, and the silent, patient men sleeping in the back rooms will explode into sudden, violent motion. But tonight, the air brings no such warning. He hears only the soft, rustling sound of the evening wind moving through the narrow corridor of the alley outside. It catches the edge of a loose wooden shutter somewhere high above the street, causing it to tap gently and rhythmically against the brickwork of an insula. Tap, tap, tap. It is a lonely, domestic sound, the auditory signature of a sleeping household completely unaware of the man sitting in the dark below, guarding their rest. The watchman closes his eyes for a moment, not to sleep, but to isolate his hearing even further. He sits in the heavy, tallow-scented dark, his breathing slowed to match the quiet cadence of the building.
The hollow plink of the water clock measures out the seconds. The distant river rolls endlessly toward the sea. The city breathes in and out, a massive, slumbering organism of stone and timber, held safe in the quiet, capable hands of the men who do not sleep. He opens his eyes, letting his gaze fall on the rough planks of the door. The first watch has ended. The second watch has begun. He settles deeper into the hard oak of the scamnum. He is going nowhere, and he is listening to everything. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the empty, echoing alleys of Trastevere, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The watchman remains seated on the heavy oak bench, his breathing slow and even, his ears tuned to the vast, hollow acoustic network of the sleeping city. The distant rumble of the heavy supply carts has long since faded, swallowed by the winding geography of the capital. The excubatorium has settled back into its profound, undisturbed quiet, measured only by the endless rhythmic dripping of the bronze water clock in the alcove. Then, a new sound registers in the dark. It does not come from the distant thoroughfares, but from the immediate labyrinth of the neighborhood. It is the sharp, solitary sound of a pedestrian's sandals striking the basalt paving stones. The sound is incredibly isolated, echoing off the tall plaster walls of the narrow alleyways. In the daytime, a single set of footsteps would be entirely lost in the roar of 1,000,000 people moving, shouting, and working. But at this hour, in the deep hollow of the second watch, the rhythmic clack-clack of the leather soles is as distinct as a hammer striking an anvil. The watchman does not tense, and he does not immediately stand. He simply shifts his focus, tracking the invisible geometry of the sound. The footsteps are moving slowly, lacking the urgent, panicked tempo of a fleeing criminal or a running messenger. They are the heavy, dragging steps of an exhausted man. The sound bounces erratically at first, muffled by a turn in the street, and then suddenly grows sharper, clearer. The traveler has turned into the specific alley that houses the excubatorium. The watchman stands up from the wooden bench. His movements are deliberate and unhurried. The long hours of the fixed post stiffen the joints, and he takes a moment to stretch his shoulders beneath his heavy woolen tunic. He steps away from the bench and walks quietly across the brick floor of the vestibule, moving toward the massive iron-studded timber door that separates the guardhouse from the street. The footsteps outside are very close now. They slow down, faltering for a moment before coming to a complete halt directly on the other side of the heavy wooden planks. The absolute silence of the night rushes back in to fill the void left by the stopped sandals. For a long moment, nothing happens. The watchman stands perfectly still, waiting in the wavering, greasy light of the tallow torch. Then comes a sound, not a heavy, demanding pound, but a soft, hesitant rapping of knuckles against the dark wood of the door. You would expect a midnight encounter at an imperial guardhouse to be a moment of high tension, a sudden clash of authority involving drawn weapons, harsh interrogations, and sharp shouted demands echoing into the dark. Instead, the interaction that follows is an incredibly quiet, almost murmured exchange, utterly devoid of any real friction. The policing duties of the vigiles are not those of a front-line military unit. They are administrative, practical, and deeply rooted in the mundane reality of the neighborhood.
The watchman does not unbar the heavy door. To open the main entrance of the excubatorium in the middle of the night is a cumbersome, unnecessary breach of security. Instead, he reaches out to a small square feature built directly into the center of the massive timber frame at eye level. It is a fenestella, a small viewing grate backed by a sliding iron panel. He grips the small iron knob of the panel and slides it to the right. The metal tracks are well oiled, and the panel moves smoothly with a quiet, heavy scrape. A square of the pitch-black night is instantly revealed, framed by the thick wood of the door. The crisp, damp air of the street flows immediately through the opening, cutting through the warm, heavy scent of the burning tallow inside the vestibule. The watchman leans forward, bringing his face close to the iron grate. On the other side of the bars stands a single man. He is illuminated by the weak, trembling light of a small terracotta hand lamp he holds in his right hand. The lamp is cheap and mass-produced, its spout heavily blackened by soot, casting just enough of a dim orange glow to reveal the man's face. He is older, his skin deeply lined, and he wears a simple, undyed woolen cloak pulled tightly around his shoulders against the damp river chill. "Peace to the watch," the man says. His voice is a low, raspy whisper, careful not to carry up to the sleeping apartments in the buildings above them. "And to you," the watchman replies, his own voice equally low, a calm baritone slipping through the iron bars. "It is late to be walking the streets of the 14th region. The public baths are drained and the taverns are barred. Where are you bound?" When Augustus formed the vigiles, their primary mandate was the suppression of fire. But a city that burns easily is also a city that hides its sins in the dark. The emperor recognized that a massive force patrolling the streets at night naturally served a secondary, vital function: light policing. The watchmen are the deterrents against the fures, the common thieves, and the grassatores, the violent muggers who haunt the unlit alleys. They are authorized to question anyone moving through the city after dark, to detain suspicious individuals, and to hold them until morning when they can be handed over to the urban cohorts for proper judgment. The older man shifts his weight, bringing the small clay lamp slightly higher. "I am returning to my insula near the bakeries of the lower street. I am a fuller. We had a vat of wool that required a late soaking, and the master kept us past the sunset to see it done. I am only seeking my bed." The watchman listens to the words, but he is paying far more attention to the sensory details of the man standing before him. The policing of the night is rarely about complex detective work. It is an exercise in instinct and observation.
He looks at the man's hands. They are heavily stained, the skin dyed a faint, permanent blue, the undeniable physical proof of a fuller's trade, working with indigo and harsh ammonia all day. He breathes in the air drifting through the iron grate. He does not smell the sharp, metallic odor of hidden weapons, or the pungent, undeniable scent of sulfur or pitch that an arsonist might carry. Instead, the man smells heavily of stale water, wet wool, and the deep, bone-weary exhaustion of manual labor. There is no panic in the man's eyes, only the dull, pleading fatigue of a citizen who simply wants to go home. He is not a runaway slave, darting nervously at every shadow. He is not a thief, carrying a heady sack of stolen goods. He is exactly what he claims to be. But there is one detail the watchman must address. He nods toward the small, sputtering flame in the man's hand. "Your lamp is burning low," the watchman says quietly, "and you are carrying it close to your cloak. The wind is picking up from the river." This is the true intersection of the watchman's duties. To carry an open flame through the streets of Rome at night is a dangerous necessity. Without a lamp, a pedestrian will quickly break an ankle on the uneven paving stones or stumble into an open drainage trench. But a careless man with a lamp is the greatest threat the city faces. A trip, a fall, a shattered clay vessel, and a pool of burning oil spreading across the dry timber threshold of a shop. That is how neighborhoods are erased from the map. The older man looks down at his lamp,
suddenly aware of how closely he has drawn it to the frayed edge of his woolen garment for warmth. He quickly extends his arm, holding the flame at a safer distance. "You are right, Watchman. I was careless. The dampness was getting into my bones. I will hold it clear." "See that you do," the watchman replies, his tone completely flat, devoid of anger, but carrying the heavy, unyielding authority of the state. "Walk in the center of the paving stones, keep the flame away from the awnings, and go straight to your door." "I will. Thank you. Good watch to you." The watchman gives a single brief nod. He pulls his hand back from the iron grate. With a smooth, practiced motion, he slides the heavy metal panel back into place. The iron meets the wooden frame with a solid, definitive clack, instantly cutting off the cold draft from the street and plunging the other side of the door back into absolute darkness. He stands by the door and listens. On the other side of the thick timber, the older man pauses for a moment, adjusting his grip on the small terracotta lamp. Then the rhythmic clack-clack of the leather sandals resumes. The sound moves away from the excubatorium, tracing a path down the narrow alley, growing fainter and fainter until it is completely swallowed by the vast, complex architecture of Trastevere.
The watchman turns away from the door. The brief, mundane encounter has not raised his pulse or broken his calm. It was a simple administrative check, a microscopic adjustment to the safety of the sleeping city. He has verified a citizen, corrected a fire hazard, and maintained the quiet order of his district. There will be no report written, no grand record kept of the tired fuller and his dying lamp. It is simply the friction of millions of people living stacked on top of one another, managed in the dark by men trained to observe. He walks back across the vestibule, stepping back into the aggressive, dancing light of the tallow torch. The sharp scent of the burning fat seems warmer now, more familiar after the brief exposure to the cold river air. He returns to the heavy oak bench against the wall. He lowers himself back down, resting his forearms on his knees, and allows his body to settle once again into the hard wood. He closes his eyes. The hollow, metallic plink of the water clock resumes its prominent place in his awareness. The city has returned to its baseline of silence. The stranger is gone, and the watch continues, exactly as it has for decades. The water clock in the darkened alcove continues its slow, unyielding work. The hollow, metallic plink of the water drops falling from the upper basin into the lower vessel is a constant, rhythmic anchor in the deep silence of the vestibule. For hours, the watchman has sat on the heavy oak bench, listening to the city outside and the gentle settling of the guardhouse around him. But now, the cadence of the night is shifting. The second watch, the deep, heavy hours leading up to midnight, is coming to an end. It is time for the third watch to begin. The physical reality of the excubatorium is that it is not simply a staging ground for equipment. It is a densely packed house of sleeping men. When the state formed the vigiles, they did not just assign men to wander the streets blindly until dawn. They instituted a rigorous, staggered system of patrols. Of the roughly 7,000 men in the 7 cohorts across Rome, only a fraction are actively walking the streets at any given moment. The rest are resting in reserve, waiting for their turn in the dark, or waiting for the alarm bell to pull them all into the fray at once. Here in Trastevere, the 7th cohort is divided into 7 distinct centuries, each consisting of roughly 70 to 80 men, commanded by a centurion. In the daylight, 80 men moving together in armor is a formidable, undeniable presence.
but at night, divided into smaller squads and scattered across the sleeping districts, their footprint is meant to be light, almost invisible. The watchman shifts his weight on the bench, turning his head slightly toward the interior corridor that leads deeper into the converted private house. The rooms that surround the central courtyard, the former dining rooms, the studies, and the private bedrooms of the wealthy family that once lived here, have been transformed into cramped, functional barracks. The men sleep in simple wooden bunks, wrapped tightly in their thick woolen cloaks against the damp chill that seeps up from the floorboards. You would expect the changing of the guard in an imperial outpost to be announced by the sharp, piercing blast of a brass trumpet and the harsh, barked orders of a commanding officer, mirroring the rigid discipline of the frontline legions. Instead, the rotation of the vigiles happens with the quiet, muffled efficiency of men desperate not to wake the sleeping city that surrounds them. There are no trumpets blown in the courtyard. There are no shouted commands echoing off the plastered walls. The process begins with a single man, the tesserarius. He is a junior officer, second only to the centurion and the optio, and his specific duty is the administration of the night's passwords. The watchman hears the soft shuffling steps of the tesserarius moving through the central courtyard. He carries no torch, navigating the familiar layout of the extubatorium entirely by memory and the faint starlight filtering down through the open roof.
The officer moves from room to room, stepping quietly into the cramped barracks. He does not yell to wake the next squad. He simply walks to the bunks of the men designated for the third watch, reaching out in the dark to give each man a firm, silent shake of the shoulder. It is a gentle but insistent pressure. The men of the watch are light sleepers, their bodies conditioned to rise quickly from the edge of unconsciousness. Slowly, the interior of the guardhouse begins to hum with the low, muted sounds of a dozen men waking up simultaneously. The watchman hears the creak of wooden bed frames as legs are swung over the sides. He hears the soft rustling sound of heavy wool being pulled over shoulders and belted at the waist. There is the dull, repetitive scraping of heavy, hobnailed sandals being pulled onto feet and laced tightly around the ankles. It is the sound of reluctant, methodical preparation, entirely devoid of urgency. In a few moments, the men of the relief squad emerge from the interior rooms and step into the staging area of the vestibule, joining the watchman in the flickering, aggressive light of the tallow torch. They move slowly, still shaking off the heavy fog of sleep. They do not speak. A few rub their eyes. Others simply stare blankly at the brick floor, letting their minds adjust to the cold reality of the waking world. The tesserarius stands at the head of the small group. In his hand, he holds a small rectangular object that he brings forward into the light. It is the tessera, a small block of smooth, polished boxwood. It is no larger than a man's palm, perfectly flat on both sides. On the surface of the wood, a single word has been burned into the grain with a hot iron stylus. This is the password for the night. In the chaotic, pitch-black labyrinth of Rome's narrow alleys, visibility is often reduced to a few feet. When two separate squads of vigiles cross paths in the dark, or when a patrol encounters a lone watchman like the one guarding this door, there must be a way to identify one another instantly, without alerting anyone else in the surrounding buildings. The tesserarius holds the small wooden block up for the squad leader to read. Tonight, the word burned into the wood is Castor. It is a simple, easily remembered name, honoring one of the twin gods who protect the city. The squad leader nods, mouthing the word silently to commit it to memory. He then turns and whispers it to the man standing next to him, who whispers it to the next, until the password has been rippled quietly through the entire squad. The wooden tablet itself will not leave the guardhouse. Its purpose is merely to convey the official mark of the watch. The tesserarius slips the boxwood block back into a leather pouch on his belt, his duty fulfilled for the hour.
Now the exchange must happen. The watchman rises from his bench,
the heavy oak groaning slightly beneath him. He steps over to the massive timber door that opens onto the street. He lifts the heavy iron latch, moving it slowly so the metal does not clank, and pulls the door inward just enough to allow two men to pass shoulder to shoulder. The cold, damp air of the street instantly rushes into the vestibule, carrying the sharp scent of the river and the deep, silent chill of the midnight hour. The relief squad steps outside, filing through the narrow gap with practiced ease, but the door is not closed behind them. The watchman holds it open, waiting. A moment later, the returning squad emerges from the darkness of the alley. They are the men who have walked the second watch, and they are moving with the heavy, dragging steps of deep exhaustion. As they cross the stone threshold and step into the light of the vestibule, the watchman can read the physical toll of the last 3 hours on their bodies. They bring the smell of the city in with them. It is a profound, earthy odor. Their woolen cloaks are damp with the heavy river fog that settles over Trastevere after dark. They smell of cold sweat, of wood smoke from lingering chimney fires, and of the stale, muddy dust of the unpaved back alleys. The contrast between the two groups of men is stark. The outgoing squad is stiff, silent, and sleepy. The returning squad is loose-limbed, heavily fatigued, and breathing hard, their faces shiny with the dampness of the night air. The returning men do not linger in the vestibule. The strict discipline of the excubitorum dictates that equipment must be immediately returned to its rightful place. Several of the men carry the heavy leather hame, the buckets they took with them on their patrol. They walk over to the long wooden rack on the wall. The watchman listens to the familiar sounds of the gear being stowed. The stiff cowhide of the buckets scrapes softly against the wood as they are lined up in perfect rows. A man who carried one of the short, heavy axes hooks it back onto its iron pegs, ensuring the handle is perfectly balanced. Once their hands are empty, the men of the returning squad bypass the watchman entirely. They nod to him in the dim light, a silent acknowledgement between men who share the same exhausting burden, and shuffle past him toward the interior corridor. They are heading for the very bunks that the relief squad just vacated. The blankets will still be warm. Within minutes, they will drop onto the wooden frames, pull their cloaks over their heads, and fall instantly into a deep, dreamless sleep. Out in the street, the outgoing squad has already arranged itself into a loose, practical formation. They do not march in rigid, locked steps like a legion on a parade ground. They walk with a fluid, rolling gait, designed to conserve energy and navigate the treacherous, uneven paving stones in the dark. The squad leader carries a fresh tallow torch, holding it low so the light catches the ground before their feet.
The watchman looks through the gap in the doorway, watching the small cluster of men move away from the excubatorium. The dancing orange light of their torch throws long, jagged shadows against the brick walls of the alley. The rhythmic crunch of their hobnailed sandals grows fainter and fainter, a slow, fading heartbeat moving out into the vast circulatory system of the city. Soon, the light turns a corner and disappears completely, taking the sound of the footsteps with it. The rotation is complete. The third watch has officially begun. The watchman pulls the heavy wooden door shut. The thick timber meets the doorframe with a solid, definitive thud that seals the guardhouse off from the world once again. He drops the heavy iron latch back into place, securing the excubatorium for the next 3 hours. The brief flurry of activity has passed, leaving the vestibule feeling even quieter than before. The sharp smell of the damp river fog dissipates,
overcome once again by the heavy, familiar scent of the burning tallow torch above him. The interior of the house has settled back into absolute silence. The returning men are already asleep, and the outgoing men are miles away in the dark. He returns to his place at the heavy oak bench. The fixed post remains unchanged. He does not patrol. He does not carry the leather buckets through the streets. He is the anchor, the static point around which the entire cohort revolves. He sits back down, resting his forearms on his knees, and turns his attention back to the slow, hollow dripping of the water clock in the alcove, letting the deep hours of the night wash over him. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the heavy, damp river fog, but inside the stone, nothing stirs. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
The third watch of the night is always the heaviest. The initial novelty of the dark has long since burned away, and the faint, lingering warmth of the previous day has entirely bled out of the stone walls. It is in these deep, hollow hours, roughly between midnight and 3 in the morning, that the human body actively rebels against being awake. The silence of the excubatorium ceases to be merely a lack of noise and becomes a physical weight, a thick, invisible pressure pressing down on the watchman's shoulders. To fight the slow, creeping paralysis of fatigue, the watchman must engage his mind. He cannot pace the vestibule endlessly, nor can he engage in conversation. He must find something small, quiet, and deeply personal to anchor his attention. He reaches beneath the heavy fold of his woolen cloak, slipping his fingers into a small leather pouch tied securely to his belt. He feels the familiar, smooth shapes of his few personal possessions, a spare length of twine, a whetstone for his utility knife, and a small, flat square of wood. He pulls the wooden object out into the flickering orange light of the tallow torch. It is a pugilaris, a miniature set of writing tablets. It consists of 2 thin leaves of boxwood, no larger than the span of his palm, bound together along one edge by a tight hinge of leather cord. The watchman opens the tablets like a small book. The interior faces of the wood have been hollowed out to create a shallow depression which is filled with a layer of dark, hardened beeswax. The wax has been mixed with fine charcoal soot to turn it completely black, ensuring that any mark made upon it will stand out sharply in the dim light. He withdraws a small stylus carved from animal bone from the same pouch. One end is sharpened to a fine point for scratching into the wax. The other is flattened and spatulate, used to smooth over old marks and erase them. He holds the open tablet near his chest, letting the ambient heat of his own body soften the surface of the wax just a fraction. He brings the tablet closer to his face, breathing in the scent. Beneath the heavy, greasy odor of the burning sebum that fills the vestibule, the wax carries a faint, remarkably sweet scent of honey and summer fields. It's a fragile, agricultural smell, an unexpected comfort in the cold, damp stone of the guardhouse. He uses the sharp point of the bone stylus to trace the lines already cut into the black wax. There is no poetry here. There are no letters to distant relatives, no philosophical musings on the nature of the empire. The wax contains only a series of small, meticulously organized hash marks. It is a calendar. It is the math of his own life. Every mark represents a month of completed service in the 7th cohort. He traces his stylus over the first row, then the second, his eyes counting the tiny grooves. The act of reading the marks grounds him, connecting the agonizingly slow drip of the water clock in the alcove to the vast, sweeping passage of years.
You would expect the men trusted to guard the physical heart of the empire, the men who hold the safety of Rome in their calloused hands, to be drawn from its most elite privileged families. You would expect the Watchmen to be patrician sons with ancient names, born to vast country estates and destined for the Senate. Instead, the safety of the capital has been placed entirely in the hands of men who until very recently were legally considered property. When Augustus originally organized the vigiles in the year 6 CE, he faced a massive logistical problem. The traditional Roman army, the legions, were strictly reserved for freeborn citizens, men who owned property and held an established place in the social hierarchy. But the legions were needed on the frontiers, holding the borders in Germania and along the Danube. To raise a standing force of 7,000 men merely to fight fires and walk the dark alleys of the capital, the emperor had to look to the lowest rungs of the social ladder. He recruited the Watchmen almost exclusively from the ranks of the libertini, the freedmen. The man sitting on the heavy oak bench was not born free. He began his life as a slave, a living instrument bound to the will of a master. He knows the humiliation of the auction block. He remembers the chalk dust rubbed onto his bare feet by the slave dealers, marking him as imported cargo. By the grace of his former master, or through the slow, agonizing accumulation of his own small savings, he eventually purchased his freedom. He was granted his liberty, given the heavy, undyed felt cap, the pileus, to wear on his head to signify his new status, and allowed to walk the streets without a collar. But freedom is not the same thing as belonging. A freedman in Rome exists in a strange, frustrating twilight. He is no longer a slave, but he is not a true, full Roman. He is heavily restricted in his rights. He cannot legally marry a freeborn woman, meaning any children he fathers will carry the complicated secondary legal status of their parent. He cannot leave a fully recognized Roman will to distribute his modest property when he dies. And he is still legally bound to his former master, now his patron, obligated to show deference and perform duties for the family that once owned him. He is a man who is tolerated by the city, allowed to exist in its shadows, but denied a place in the light. That is, until the passing of the Lex Vigilia. In the year 24 CE, a new law was codified, creating a highly specific transaction between the state and the freedmen of Rome. The empire needed reliable, disciplined men to endure the crushing, unglamorous labor of the night watch. In exchange, the state offered the one thing a freedman could not buy with silver or gold: an identity. The law dictated that any freedman who enlisted in the vigiles and served a term of 6 consecutive years would be granted full, unrestricted Roman citizenship.
The watchman stares down at the black wax in his hand. The tiny scratched hash marks are the physical record of this monumental transaction. He has completed 4 years and 2 months. He is well past the halfway mark, but the finish line still feels agonizingly distant. 6 years does not sound like an eternity to a wealthy merchant sitting in a sunlit villa on the Palatine Hill, but for a man of the Sebestieri, 6 years is a grueling, brutal marathon of endurance. It is 2,119 nights spent awake in the dark. It is thousands of hours of breathing in the thick, choking dust of collapsed plaster, the sour stench of the vinegar mats, and the toxic black smoke of burning timber. It is 6 years of risking a crushed spine from a falling roof beam, or a severe, crippling burn from an overturned oil vat. Every single hash mark carved into this wax tablet represents 30 nights of surviving the very worst the city has to offer. but the reward is worth any hardship. The Watchman does not dream of battlefield glory or chests of plundered gold. His ambition is entirely bureaucratic, yet profoundly beautiful. When his 6 years are complete, he will not receive a laurel wreath. He will simply be called before a magistrate. His name will be entered into the official census rolls of the city. The legal stain of his past will be wiped completely clean by the machinery of the empire. He will gain the tria nomina, the 3 names of a true Roman citizen. More importantly, the change will alter the destiny of his bloodline forever. With the rights of full citizenship, his marriage will be recognized as connubium, a lawful Roman union. Any children born to him after that day will not be freedmen. They will be free-born Romans, inheriting all the rights, privileges, and dignities of the greatest empire on earth. They will never know the chalk on their feet. They will never owe deference to a patron. They will be able to wear the pure white toga of a citizen, to vote in the assemblies, to own property outright, and to walk the streets of the city in the daylight without lowering their eyes. This is the quiet, burning ambition that fuels the entire cohort. It is the reason the men do not mutiny when the night is freezing and the rain is falling in sheets across the courtyard. It is the reason they endure the heavy, soot-stained labor without complaint. They are not fighting for an emperor they will likely never meet. They are fighting for the legal future of their unborn grandchildren.
The Watchman runs the flat, spatulate end of his bone stylus lightly over the bottom edge of the wax, smoothing out a small imperfection in the surface. He does not add a mark tonight. The month is not yet over. He must wait, practicing the deep, unyielding patience that the fixed post demands. He closes the 2 leaves of the wooden tablet. The dark beeswax is sealed away, the sweet scent of honey instantly swallowed by the heavy odor of the tallow torch. He slides the bone stylus back into the leather pouch on his belt, followed by the small wooden diptych. He pulls the strings tight, securing his future against his side, and folds the heavy wool of his cloak back over his waist. The physical act of checking his tally has served its purpose. The crushing weight of the 3rd watch has receded, replaced by a renewed, quiet resolve. The fatigue in his muscles remains, but the fog in his mind has cleared. He knows exactly who he is, exactly where he stands, and exactly what he is buying with the hours of his life. He leans back against the rough plaster wall of the vestibule, letting the heavy oak bench support his weight. The water clock in the alcove drops another single hollow bead of water into the bronze basin. Plink. Another second gone. Another fraction of the 6 years paid in full. He settles into the stillness, his eyes open, his ears tuned to the dark, ready to trade the rest of the night for a piece of the eternal city.
The 4th watch of the night, the quarta vigilia, is a profound test of human endurance. It is the final, agonizing stretch of time before the sun returns, and it brings with it the deepest, most biting cold of the entire cycle. The damp chill that rises from the sluggish waters of the Tiber has had hours to settle over Trastevere, creeping up the brickwork of the insulae and seeping through the thick plaster walls of the excubitorium. The Watchman sits motionless on the heavy oak bench, his woolen cloak pulled tightly around his shoulders. The deep silence of the guardhouse remains unbroken, but the texture of the silence has fundamentally changed. During the 1st watch, the quiet was an active thing, a heavy blanket pulled over a restless, breathing city. Now, in these final hours, the silence is frail and exhausted, worn incredibly thin by the long passage of time. The water clock in the darkened alcove continues its hollow, metallic dripping. The sound feels slower now,
as if the water itself is struggling against the cold. The tallow torch in the iron sconce above him, which burned with such aggressive, towering energy at the beginning of the night, is finally failing. The heavy bulb of linen and animal fat has been reduced to a charred, blackened knot of raw hemp. The thick crust of white sebum is entirely gone, melted away hours ago. Now the fire is feeding on the very last drops of liquid oil soaked deep into the core of the wrapping. The flame is low, sputtering and hissing weakly, casting a dim, exhausted and bruised orange light across the stone floor of the vestibule. Thick, heavy ribbons of soot continue to spiral upward, painting the timber ceiling a little darker, but the fierce heat of the torch has broken. The watchman does not replace the torch. He knows the rhythm of the city, and he knows that the light of the Sebastiari is no longer needed. He closes his eyes and shifts his awareness out past the heavy wooden door one last time. The transition from night to morning in the capital of the empire does not happen in the sky. It begins on the ground. He hears it first in the subtle shift of the air currents moving through the alley. For hours the wind has smelled solely of damp river mud and cold dust. Now a new scent cuts through the heavy, greasy odor of the guardhouse vestibule. It is the sharp, clean, unmistakable smell of burning pine and oak. 2 streets over, the massive commercial bakeries of Trastevere are waking up. Before the first rays of the sun even touch the terracotta roofs, the bakers are lighting the deep, brick-lined ovens that will feed the district. The watchman listens closely, and he can hear the low, rhythmic, crushing sound of the heavy basalt millstones turned by the slow, plodding hooves of blindfolded mules. The sound is a deep, comforting vibration, a signal that the great, mechanical heart of the city is beginning to beat once more.
Soon after, other sounds join the low rumble of the mills. Down by the public fountains, the Lacus, the watchman hears the sharp, echoing splash of water hitting stone, followed by the hollow clatter of wooden buckets being filled. The slaves and servants of the neighborhood have emerged from their apartments to draw the day's water before the chaotic crush of the morning traffic begins. You would expect the end of such a grueling vigil to be marked by a triumphant blast of a horn, a sudden and joyous release from duty as the darkness is finally vanquished. Instead, the night simply bleeds away, unceremoniously and unnoticed by most, gradually replaced by the gray, heavy, working reality of the morning. There is no celebration, only a slow, quiet unspooling of the tension that has gripped the guardhouse for the last 12 hours. The watchman rises from the oak bench for the final time. His legs are stiff, and his joints ache from the cold and the long immobility. He stretches his arms slowly, rolling his shoulders to work the stiffness from his muscles. His hobnailed sandals scrape softly against the brick floor as he turns his back on the heavy street door and walks toward the interior of the house. He passes through the low stone archway and steps out into the central courtyard. When he stood here during the first watch, the rectangular opening of the compluvium in the roof framed a patch of absolute, impenetrable black, pierced by a few cold stars. Now, the sky above the courtyard is undergoing a profound transformation. The heavy blackness is diluting, softening into a deep slate gray. As he watches, the gray slowly lightens, taking on the faint, bruised purple hues of the approaching dawn, before finally yielding to a cold, pale blue. Beneath the opening, the shallow pool of the impluvium reflects the changing sky perfectly. The dark, mirror-like water turns a bright, shimmering silver, casting a weak, watery light upward onto the painted plaster walls of the courtyard. He looks toward the far wall, where the small shrine to the genius of the watch stands. The tiny oil lamp that he carefully fed with a pinch of spelt wheat hours ago has finally burned itself out. The wick is dry and black, and the golden, trembling light that animated the painted figures of the lares and the protective serpents is gone. In the flat, pale light of the early morning, the shrine looks ordinary, merely a niche in a brick wall, its divine presence returning to rest alongside the sleeping men. Speaking of the sleeping men, the heavy silence of the barracks is beginning to break. The morning rotation does not require the silent, tactile intervention of the tesserarius. The creeping light of the sun and the rising noise of the city are enough. From the rooms surrounding the courtyard, the watchman hears the familiar, overlapping sounds of the day squad pulling themselves from their bunks. Heavy tunics are belted, sandals are laced, and the low, gravelly voices of men clearing the sleep from their throats begin to echo softly in the damp air.
Their duty will be entirely different from his. The daytime vigiles do not carry the heavy tallow torches, nor do they rely on the absolute silence of the fixed post to hear the papery crinkle of a hidden fire. They will patrol the crowded, deafening streets, inspecting the public baths, checking the heavily loaded transport carts for hazards, and maintaining order in a city bursting with life and motion. But for the watchman, the night is over. He walks back out to the main vestibule. The space is still dominated by the deep shadows of the corners, but the pale, gray light of the dawn is beginning to bleed through the small cracks in the heavy wooden street door. It is time to extinguish the watch. He approaches the iron sconce on the wall. The tallow torch is little more than a smoking ruin, a blackened stick of ash wood topped with a dying yellow flame. He reaches out and grasps the wooden handle, lifting it free from its iron bracket. In the corner of the vestibule, resting directly on the brick floor, sits a final, heavy piece of equipment. It is not a leather bucket or an iron axe. It is a wide, shallow bronze basin filled to the brim with fine, pale sand dredged from the banks of the Tiber River. This is the snuffer. To blow out a tallow torch is impossible, and to douse it with water would only cause the remaining hot oil to violently spit and spread. The watchman holds the torch over the basin. With a single smooth downward thrust, he drives the burning head deep into the dry river sand. The effect is instantaneous. Deprived completely of air, the flame chokes and dies. A sharp, loud hiss echoes through the narrow corridor as the residual heat of the fat meets the cold sand. The watchman twists the wooden handle left and right, ensuring the embers are entirely smothered before pulling the stick back out. The fire is gone. From the blackened, greasy linen, a single thick ribbon of white smoke rises lazily into the air, carrying the heavy, acrid smell of burnt fat and charred wood. It is the final breath of the Sebastiari for the night. He tosses the ruined wooden shaft into a wooden crate against the wall, to be stripped and rewrapped with fresh linen and new sebum before the sun sets again. He turns to the massive timber door. He reaches out and grips the heavy iron bar that stretches across the center panels, locking the excubatorium securely to its frame. He lifts the bar with both hands, the heavy metal grating loudly against its iron brackets, and sets it aside. He sets the bar aside, leaning it against the plastered wall. Next, he lifts the heavy latch, letting it fall back with a dull, hollow clank. He places his hands flat against the dark, polished wood, leans his weight into it, and pushes. The heavy door groans on its massive iron hinges and swings slowly inward.
Instantly, the full weight of the morning rushes into the vestibule. The cold, crisp air of the new day sweeps through the corridor, instantly banishing the stale, trapped odors of damp stone and burning fat. A pale, slate-colored light floods across the brick floor, catching millions of tiny dust motes that dance and swirl in the sudden draft. Outside, The narrow alleyway of Trastevere is already coming alive. A stray dog trots purposefully past the entrance. 2 women carrying empty baskets walk by, their voices rising and falling in casual, everyday conversation, completely indifferent to the guardhouse or the man standing in its doorway. Above them, the heavy wooden shutters of the insulae are being thrown open one by one, welcoming the light. The city did not burn. The narrow streets remained intact. The thousands of sleeping souls in the 14th region drew their breath in peace, entirely unaware of the silent, heavy labor of the men who guarded their rest. The watchman stands in the doorway for a long moment, breathing in the clean, cold air of the morning. The deep, heavy fatigue in his bones is profound, dragging at his limbs, but his mind is completely at peace. He has paid another night of his 6 years. He has marked another tally in the black wax. He steps back from the threshold, leaving the heavy wooden door wide open to the daylight. The day squad is already moving into the vestibule, taking up their positions, their voices lifting in the cool air. The watchman does not look back. He turns away from the light, away from the noise of the waking streets, and walks slowly toward the deep, quiet interior of the guardhouse, ready, at last, to close his eyes. The guardhouse is quiet now. Outside, the wind moves slowly through the waking streets of Trastevere. But inside the stone, the long night has ended. Close your eyes and let the centuries settle into the dark.
Thank you for joining us tonight on Sleep History. The fires are out, the watch is relieved, and the sprawling city of Rome is safe for another day. As the pale morning light washes over the terracotta roofs and the ancient brickwork of Trastevere, the heavy urgency of the night finally dissolves. The men of the 7th cohort are resting now, their long, solitary vigil complete. Just as they surrender to a deep, dreamless sleep after their quiet labor, you too can let go of your day's demands. The heavy wooden doors are secured. The smoking tallowed torches have been completely extinguished in the river sand, and there is nothing left to guard. Time moves differently now, slowing down entirely, measured only by the steady, comforting rhythm of your own breathing. The stones of this ancient city have stood for millennia, outlasting empires and generations, a quiet monument to endurance. But even the eternal city must rest. Let the fading echoes of the old streets drift away into the distance, replaced entirely by the profound, heavy quiet of your own room. You are safe. You are held softly in the calm present, and the long, watchful night is over. Let your shoulders drop. Allow your body to sink deeper into the comfort of your bed, and know that history is safely preserved in the dark. Rest well, breathe slowly, and we will see you in the next era. Good night.